heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 242, covering the week of December 7th through December 11th, 2020. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. Those are great ways to keep in touch with the Institute. You can also go to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. You'll find all those social media buttons at the top of the page. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition, by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. Another great addition to your library. If you want to get a hard copy of that book, it is for sale at Amazon.com. And speaking of Amazon, if you click on that Amazon Smile button at the top of our page, every time you shop at Amazon, we'll get a few pennies back as you purchase something. So we become your preferred charity. We are a 501c3 charity. So if you like what we do, if you like our podcast, our website, all the material, all the conferences, everything we've got, of course, we've got our first Zoom conference coming up next Tuesday. We're really excited about that. There's a lot of great things going on. We had our next video come out last week. We've got another one that we're working on. We've got more Zoom conferences planned. Look, if you're making plans for the end of the year to donate money, consider the Abbeville Institute. So you can use that Amazon Smile button, or you can make a tax-deductible donation to the full extent of the law. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. You can also click on that Shop tab at Abbeville Institute. That'll take you out to our web store where you can get our logo and all kinds of cool stuff, high-quality embroidered material. So that way you can advertise the Institute. People will ask you about it. And, of course, we get a few pennies back from that as well. So there's all kinds of ways to support the Institute. The best way, of course, is to let people know you like our stuff. So go out to Facebook, go on to YouTube, go to these places and share our material. Tell people about our podcast. Do everything you can. Word of mouth is the best way to advertise. It's really interesting. There's actually a cell phone commercial out. If you ever, watching TV and the commercials come on, if you can't skip them. But there's a cell phone commercial that talks about this. Word of mouth advertising used to be the way people did it. And of course, we do need that from you as well. So we appreciate all of your support. This is the next to last podcast of the year. We've got one more before the end of the year. And so I'll be signing off for 2020 after the next podcast. But leading into that, please consider supporting the Institute. We do need your help, and we've got so many things that we're confronting now in the United States that it's just getting overwhelming with the amount of anti-Southern bigotry, really, in the United States today. I just saw that two school boards in Virginia have said they're going to change the name, or I should say one school board. Falls Church in Northern Virginia has decided they're going to change the name of two schools. Thomas Jefferson and George Mason are coming off schools in that area. Two Virginians. Now, we're not talking about, Southerners. This is not Jefferson Davis High School in Virginia or something like that. This is Thomas Jefferson and George Mason High School. A man who was president of the United States, if nothing else. That usually gets you some type of recognition. And George Mason, the father of the Bill of Rights. Why are they coming down? Because, well, even though the majority of the people in that school district thought the name should stay, the school board was persuaded by a few people that said that it hurt their feelings to have those names on those schools. This is the stuff you really can't make up. All of those members of that school board should be terminated immediately and lose their jobs. And, we've got other places in Virginia. We're having John Tyler come off a high school name, Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson is a little more thorny in terms of, my position on Wilson. You've got the Woodrow Wilson Bridge going from, I think it's, Virginia into D.C. There's the WW Bridge. So you've got Woodrow Wilson all the place. Of course, he's president of the United States. So what do? Do you pick certain presidents that are okay and certain presidents that aren't? Are we going to rename everything for presidents? Basically, Barack Obama is the only suitable president now? Where do we go from here? This is the question that we have to ask ourselves as social justice and political correctness and wokeism have taken over the entire United States. In stupid ways. This is just idiotically, it's there's no other way to describe it, just stupid. These people have lost it. And so our job at the Institute is to try to present the other side, to try to present the Southern tradition and what is true and valuable in that Southern tradition and all of its beautiful aspects. Of course, we all know every tradition has its thorns, and we're not going to be blind to that. We never have been. But there's so much that America could learn from the South. And I think that's something that we've tried to, in over 200 episodes now, approaching 250 podcast episodes and thousands of articles, hundreds of lectures, these new videos we're producing. These are things we're trying to do to balance this attack on the South. And it's hard. It's really hard because we are facing Mount Everest with flip-flops on, and we have to climb to the top. And I don't know where we go from here, but certainly we're in a long war. There's no doubt about it. And I know people are really riled up right now about this issue with Texas and the lawsuit in 17 states and joining that lawsuit against 4 states that have, they're saying that they violated their election laws. Look, if this was 1860 and 61, we know what the people would have done at that point. But you see, because of American history and the way we interpret it now, and this is part of the charge of the Institute, to talk about what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. Is decentralization valuable for modern America? I mean, or all these states now are trying to use a nationalist framework to go and combat what they perceive as election fraud. And not just that, these states changing their election laws, not through the legislatures, but through actions of the executive or a judicial branch. But again, these are national solutions. Is that part of the Southern tradition? Should we be pursuing national solutions, or should we be looking to something else? And look, I mean, this is a big question. But one of the things we've talked about extensively on this particular show on our website are the Jeffersonian solutions to these problems. And that would be decentralization. And how do we get people thinking about that in more clearly defined terms? You know, when you have Rush Limbaugh come on and say, well, we're approaching secession. And then he quickly backs off because he took a lot of flack from that, I'm sure, from the neocons who said, you can't do that's Confederacy. You can't do that. That's neo-Confederate. You've got Victor Davis Hanson and some of these others doing these kind of things. But Americans are thinking about this. I mean, look, if we're in a union where you can't trust the outcome of the election because you can't trust the other states to do the right thing, well, then what are you doing at this point? Why are you still in the union? Nathaniel Macon said clearly nullification was idiotic. Just leave the union. There's no point to be in it anymore. This is what Patrick Henry said. I mean, look, if this is going to be so bad to protect our liberties, we have to leave. So, by using lawsuits, and we're working with a Lincolnian framework to do these things. And I'm going to tell you the end result, even if Texas and these 17 other states come out on top, which I don't think they're going to. First of all, they're misreading the Electors Clause, and I know that people are very hot about this when I say something like that. And this is disputable, right? But if you go back and look at the original understanding of the Electors Clause, there's no way that you can understand it the way they're trying to. Now, there is another part of the Constitution that you could perhaps use in this particular case when it comes to the times, manners, and times, date, and manner of holding elections, is to be determined by the legislatures of the states. So you could perhaps use that as an inroad, but Congress would have control over that. And so would the states be able to sue in that way, or would the Attorney General have to go after the states for violating their own election laws, which of course would produce a bad result? I understand the frustration. Everyone knows that there's some irregularities here, and that, look, it looks like there is a cheating going on, and that ended in the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. We know that. I mean, we know that that's perhaps there. Finding the smoking gun is very difficult. It's very difficult to prove any of these things. You can have video evidence that, you can work around that, and these things can be worked around. We know that. When Nixon lost in 1960, he sent teams of lawyers into these states to try to figure out, how did I lose? And they couldn't find any smoking gun. Why? Because they're usually good about covering their tracks. So here we are. we should be talking about the Southern tradition in this way and what the founding generation or later generations would have done with the understanding of the original Constitution in this particular case. We know they wouldn't have sued. So they would have looked at this as a political question and said, you know what? If you're going to violate the Constitution, if this is what you're going to do, then we can't really do anything about it. Because, frankly, another state doesn't have the ability to control the election laws of another state, right? This is Federalism 101. Since we can't do anything about it, we should be talking about other methods of trying to handle this particular situation. Now, at the end of the day, if we didn't have a central government that had so much power, none of this would matter. None of it would matter in any way. If the central government actually followed the Constitution, then it wouldn't really matter who's president, other than foreign policy. It wouldn't really matter what who's in the Congress, because the Congress would have so limited power that the states will be handling most everything. That is the real rub. We've allowed the Lincolnian nationalist American narrative to come forward, and now the Congress has so much power, the president has so much power. This is dangerous. And now we're looking at national solutions for these things. But I digress. I mean, this is a big issue, and it's something that, of course, a lot of people are talking about, and perhaps we'll have an article or two on it at some point in the next week or so. I don't know. It depends what people send us. But let's talk about the material we did have this week and some of the things we are addressing with the Southern tradition. First and foremost, I think a lot of people have a short-sighted view. We had December 7th, of course, which is this last week, which is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And a lot of people have a very short-sighted view of what that actually means. And in many people's minds, this was the first time America had been involved in a war in the Pacific. But it wasn't. The United States, as Jack Marquardt, one of our resident scholars in Japan, has pointed out, the United States has been involved in Japan in the Pacific for a long time. In fact, when James K. Polk, who was a Southerner, by the way, wanted to acquire California, those who were against it said very clearly, look, if you get California, we're going to have Pacific wars. There was a very good history written about this by a man named Norman Graebner. It's entitled Empire on the Pacific. And certainly there were Southern imperialists, and Polk would be considered one of those. This is why Polk has received some kind of a reputation boost in the last decade or so, because neoconservatives have found Polk, and they think Polk is one of them. I mean, look, he was good on some things in domestic policy. He's for limited government, but he loved a big, expansive foreign policy. He loved a big empire. And I remember when I was a young undergraduate, I thought Polk was great for the exact same reasons. A lot of people come into their own when they start thinking about things. They're thoughtful. Well, this is this, but they are given this neoconservative interpretation of American history. And of course, if you're a conservative, quote unquote, and this is what you run with. And I thought Polk was great. I thought Jackson was great. Jackson did a couple of good things, but he also did some bad things. And Polk really created some problems with the war with Mexico. This is why John C. Calhoun opposed it. And I know that there's this new book out that says, Calhoun really was secretly an imperialist and wanted all that territory, and he just wanted to do all these things. I'll listen to Clyde Wilson, who worked with John C. Calhoun's letters and papers for most of his career at the University of South Carolina, over some little socialist nitwit who is writing a book about Calhoun. And this is the individual who wrote this. Matthew Karp is his name. He's a socialist nitwit in an Ivy League school. And he got that Ivy League position because of that book, because, of course, it's anti-Calhoun and anti-Southern. If you want a career boost, you don't write anything positive about the South, because you'll never get a job. I mean, this is it. So you better hide that until you get a job and you get tenure. Then you can do whatever you want. You can write all the pro-Southern books you want to write. But at that point, this is interesting, because we have this war, and of course Jack talks about this. The war actually took place in some cases in the Pacific. And after we acquired California, then of course you have the 1860s where you have this, and then we're involved in the Philippines with the Spanish-American War, and we're fighting jungle warfare at that point. were involved in the Boxer Rebellion in China. I mean, you go back and you look at how many times the United States was involved in the Pacific, and this doesn't even take into account the American operations in Japan before that point. You look at all the times the United States is involved in the Pacific, and much of it had to do with James K. Polk and the expansion there. And of course, Jack does a good job talking about that during the war. So I like that piece because it gives you a little different perspective on December 7th and an American foreign policy when it comes to the Pacific theater. It's something that we don't often think about, and how long-standing our interests have been in the Pacific. You've got the acquisition of Hawaii and some of the other Pacific islands. That was all part of Lincolnian Lincolnian imperialism in many ways. You know, the Lincoln administration and the Republican Party unleashed that side of American foreign policy on the world during the war. There was some discussion about supporting Cretan independence, for example. The independence movement of Crete. I mean, what does the United States have to do with that? But of course, this is where these things matter. Now, the other thing I want to mention, let me fast forward to Friday's piece, then we'll work our way back to a couple of other things. This is an old piece that Valerie Protopappas wrote a long time ago, and she wrote it. She said she sent it to me and said, I don't know if we're too far gone from this, but perhaps we still need to talk about this. And if you look at this situation and I'll just use an example with the school board decision with Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, the public doesn't want these names changed, but the school board, based on their own understanding and their own opinion, changes the name. It's terrible because this is generally what happens. The public doesn't want these things to change, but the elected people, or the unelected people, like sometimes judges, but even in some of these cases, these people are elected. We have elected judges in my state. These people go ahead and change things, and it's a disaster. It's a disaster. So where do we go from here? I mean, we're looking at this from a perspective that we have, we have these things happening in America, and a lot of it's happening now with elected legislative bodies. They're just going ahead and taking these things down. They're taking down high school names that don't even have to do with this Confederacy anymore. Look, we're beyond the Confederacy now. It's just the entire South, Virginia itself, South Carolina, whatever it is, the entire South is now part of this. And who hasn't been saying this since 2015? We have. Since 2015, the Abbeville Institute has been pointing out this is the problem. They're not going to stop at Robert E. Lee. In fact, I think I saw somewhere an article that the graffitied Robert E. Lee statue is now going to be on the cover of National Geographic. This is now considered, this is international. I mean, you think of all the people in the world that would read National Geographic. This is now considered art. It's protest art is what it's called. And so this is, cultural. It's beyond just people are protesting about Robert E. Lee. This is now going beyond that. It's getting to a point where it is taking on a life of its own. It's becoming a bigger monster than anything. And again, we said this is going to happen. All of these things are going to happen. The Confederacy is a low-hanging fruit. Once they get that, they're going after traditional American culture. It's got to change. And all over the world, they're going after Western civilization because that is considered to be the enemy of all things good, even though it produced all of this stuff that we have. This is the suicidal part of it all. It's why Pat Buchanan called it the suicide of the West. It is suicidal. You tear down the structure that created all this, and you're left with nothing. Now, when it comes to the discussion of what Southerners should do in these particular situations, we have this piece by Casey Chalk, which I thought was very good, Identity Politics and the Southern Gentleman. And some people didn't like the beginning of it. But Chalk points out that the Southern gentleman would respond to these type of charges in a different way than what is commonly being used by those on social media and others. And he brings up a anecdotal situation with a friend of his who attended University of Virginia, and he was attacked by, he's a white male, and he's attacked by another white male for not doing enough to help minorities. Because he's against some of the things that happened in the George Floyd violence that took place over the summer, and he didn't respond in a way that would betray what this individual had done. He had worked with low-income minority groups for long periods of time, with this other individual had never done anything with them. And this is what happens. Southerners, and this is something that needs to be pointed out, I think, consistently. Southerners live in many parts of the South on a day-to-day basis with a very diverse population, and people get along just fine. There isn't large-scale racial violence. People work together. People intermingle together in ways that Northerners would find, I think, surprising. And that's because the perception of the South does not meet the reality of the South. I think that, and I remember years, people talk about, racism in the North versus racism in the South. What does this even mean? And the idea was always that, Southerners would just be a little more open about it than Northerners, but the North was very racist, and you have this virtue signaling out of the North that you don't get in the South. And it's easy to do, of course, in the North when you have, very small minority populations, and you can always displace what you think other people should do on someone else in places with large minority populations. But again, for the most part in the South, and we've run pieces on this, how peaceful interactions between people of different races in the South are on an everyday basis. And that white Southerners and black Southerners work and mingle together all the time. That they have peaceful interaction on a daily basis. That you don't have large-scale race wars going on in the South all the time. And you wouldn't. And people are surprised by this, I think, in the North. Look at where, and Chalk points this out, look where all these big race riots were, all in the North. Why? And the point is, and you look at the most segregated areas in the United States, in the North. Why? Because Northerners, again, are virtue signaling because they feel their own inadequacies in these areas, and then they find the South, to place all of the shame on. This is all of your fault. Everything if bad in America is your fault. And I think that's where, this attack on the Southern tradition, it works well with attack on the flag or monuments or Thomas Jefferson. Look, we've had Thomas Jefferson as one of our symbols since the Institute started in 2002. I guess that's now going to be considered to be hostile to other groups of people. To have Thomas Jefferson. It's sad what we're going through. It's very sad. And of course, we had a couple other good pieces. One on James Henry Thornwell, one of the great Southern theologians, now, of course, persona non grata in the evangelical Christian community because he was pro-slavery. But as Zachary Garris points out, there was a lot more to Thornwell than simply pro-slavery. And we had someone who supported the Institute say that, they knew family members that were, in that Thornwell family. And these were very benevolent Christian people. And I think we forget that. How important Thornwell was to American Christianity. Across, not just in the South, but across the world, how important he was to American Christianity. And Thornwell and others, Dabney, there are plenty of people in the South who are now considered to be terrible people because of woke culture, but who really contributed a lot to society and a lot to Christianity, a lot to morals, manners, customs, art, literature, music, all of these things, politics, because they held views on race that modern Americans find repugnant. So because of one thing, everything else they say is wrong. If you start down that path, again, you're going to look at a situation where we can't have anybody that we celebrate before, say, 1975 or even later. Because even in the 1970s, you had racists in Congress. Look, Joe Biden was friends with a lot of them, and this is where, he took a lot of heat in the primaries. This Kamala Harris called him a racist, essentially, for being friends with Southerners during the 1970s when Biden was first in the Congress. And Biden himself had stood up and said things that you would consider to be racist. I mean, this is where we get into this hypocrisy of everything. And it's sad that we're going through this in modern American society, that you can't. I mean, Jimmy Carter, when Jimmy Carter was inaugurated, George Wallace was right behind him. That would never happen today. Never in a million years would that happen today. And finally, the last piece of the week that I want to touch on here is this Hill Folk history piece by Travis Archie. And it gets into a little known Southern writer named Silas Claiborne Turnbow, or Clabe. And look, he wrote some really good local histories. This is an important thing that I think we need to finish with as people start looking at this idea of decentralization. There are so many good historians out there who are not professional historians. And you find a lot of them in the 19th century. And so by looking at that, we need to be pulling these people out, these individuals like Silas Turnbow, who wrote great stuff, and they're just in these local areas. I mean, we've got, in my state, there was a very good local historian who, again, nowadays we consider, oh my gosh, you can't read that because they would have views on things that would be not comport with modern society. But on the other hand, they did very good work in the history of this particular state. And I think that's where we run into some of the issues here. We pay attention to Eric Foner, for example, but we forget about these smaller histories. And Turnbow also wrote great literature, and the two go hand in hand. One of the things you can say about Douglas Southall Freeman, by the way, not a trained historian. Douglas Southall Freeman was a newspaperman. He was a journalist. And he wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Robert E. Lee. Right? I mean, Margaret Coit, not a trained historian, but wrote a award-winning biography of John C. Calhoun. You see, Shelby Foote, not a trained historian, but wrote books on the war that people devour because they're good. The trained historians tend to write bad stuff. They can't write. They don't know what they're doing. They simply go out and collect information and kind of regurgitate it, and it's awful. But Foote and Freeman and others knew how to write. I mean, Robert Self Henry, his story of the Confederacy, story of the Mexican War, story of Reconstruction, they're good. Even Merton Coulter, who's, he was a trained historian, but he understood a little better how to write than many people. And I think that's what separates people like Silas Turnbow from modern historians, trained historians that don't know how to write. I mean, these people, many of them can't even put a paragraph together that sounds coherent. And this is because we think we have to produce this writing that's so academic that only academics can get through it. Why? And most of that is just jargon, and it relates back to, sociology and other things, psychology, and it's jargon. It means nothing. It means nothing. Write where people can read it. Make it a story that people want to read. And you'll get more people interested in it. And so that's what I like about this piece on Silas Turnbow by Travis Archie. He points that out. These people could write. And they wrote great histories and great stuff, and we should pay attention to those things. All right, so again, this is the next to last podcast for the year of 2020. And we had some great stuff this week. We got great stuff coming next week. And we'll see you next week. So until next time, good day.